Admittedly, it's difficult to talk about science in the abstract. There are many sciences, each employing a methodology of its own. The Latin word scientia means knowledge, but obviously not all knowledge can claim to be scientific, though it's often thought of as such. Enumeration is not science, that is, counting things is not science, nor is technology to be equated with science, although frequently it is thought to be so. Precise observation is not science, nor is the correlation of data, which at first sight seems to be related. We speak of medical science when we mean the art of medicine. Engineering, too, is thought of as science, but like medicine, engineering draws upon a wealth of scientifically achieved information, but is not itself a science. The systematic collection of data is often taken to be scientific, as is the ability to make predictions based on the accumulation of data with respect to past instances. The application of scientific information is essentially an art with its own rules of application, much like prudence is the application of wisdom. We may not think of theology as a science, but Aristotle made room for a divine science. Today we call it natural theology and distinguish it from sacred theology, that is, theology which takes its premises from revelation. There's a whole cadre of disciplines we categorize as social sciences, but most of the time when we speak of science, we're thinking of natural science, physics, chemistry, biology, and the like. Few think of philosophy and theology as science, but a case can be made that both, in their foremost representatives, constitute scientific inquiry. Now, I am arguing from a realistic perspective that the fundamental goal of science is to render intelligible that which is unintelligible in terms of itself. I will insist, contrary to popular opinion, that science is not reducible to description, to prediction, or to control, but rather is directed to an understanding of nature and natural processes. It must be admitted that theories that purport to describe the nature of scientific explanation vary as widely as philosophies vary. A philosophy of science is but a part of one's overarching metaphysical outlook, painstakingly derived from considerations of nature, law, intelligibility, causality, and inference. Most philosophies of science have been shaped by the social and intellectual milieu in which they arise. Our discussion of these will take notice of the historical situation in which they were initially offered, for the history of philosophy is much more a part of philosophy than the history of science is a part of any science. I lecture from an Aristotelian point of view, employing the text of Aristotle as commented upon and amplified over the centuries. Although challenged by modernity, that point of view remains viable. I will try to show modernity cannot be understood apart from its break with Plato and Aristotle. The fortunes of Aristotle or bound up with the fortunes of metaphysics. Once the core of any philosophical curriculum, metaphysics has become, where it is still practiced, one specialized discipline among others. In the golden age of American philosophy, the age of Peirce, James, Royce, Whitehead, and Santayana, the centrality of metaphysics was uncontested, and later even by the pragmatists who followed the lead of John Dewey. Reflections on the nature and capacity of human knowledge date to the pre-Socratics. Plato's discussion of science and the claims to knowledge by the Greeks will forever remain the starting point of the philosophy of science. It was Plato who bequeathed to Western philosophy the notion that science is of the universal. Aristotle concurred, but found the universal not in some Platonic heaven. That's not the way to put it, though. Well, he concurred, but found the universal in the nature common to all members of the species. Aristotle taught that by a process of abstraction, we come to know the essence, the nature, the quiddity of a thing, prescinding from its accidental features, which it may or may not have. One of these books that came in the other day, Aristotle's Theory of Abstraction, I can recommend. And the other was, who has it? Do you have it there?
Yeah. There should be this one here.
Yeah. An Aristotelian Realist Philosophy of Mathematics by James Franklin. These books arrived at my desk about 2 weeks ago. So I haven't read them, but I've looked at them, and I think they would support everything I'm going to say here. Well, such is the object of science, the nature of an entity, the structure of a process. That process may be simply the progression of an illness, or a process we find in nature as squirrels prepare for the winter by bearing the nuts, objective scientific knowledge. Yet to have scientific knowledge is not simply to know what is, not simply to have uncovered a law of nature. For Aristotle, to have scientific knowledge is to know the entity, process, or property in the light of its causes. Why do things happen the way they do? Presupposed by Aristotle are two principles. This is a point of contention with modern philosophy. The principle of causality and the principle of substance. Both principles rejected by the British empiricist. The positivism advanced by Auguste Comte denies at once the intelligibility of nature and the power of the intellect to grasp the more that is given in the sense report. From an Aristotelian perspective, there is more in the sense report than the senses themselves are formally able to appreciate. John Locke, in denying the reality of substance, reduces what we call substance to a constellation of events, or sense reports. I mean, when you talk about copper, that's just a shorthand way of not at the moment being able to list all the properties which defines copper from a purely sense point of view. Hume, in his account of causality, similarly limits knowledge to a simple sense report. We experience succession, Hume tells us, not causation. Cause is the name we give to the antecedent, contiguous in place, continuous in time, and habitually associated with the consequent, which we call the effect. Well, if there are no natures or substances independent of the mind's creating them, if there is no causality, not only the enterprise of metaphysics collapses, but modern science is transformed into something other than an attempt to understand nature and its operations in the light of its causes. Well, to talk about modern science is certainly to take note of the contribution of Isaac Newton, because of the role that mathematics plays in natural philosophy. But it must be acknowledged that ever since Pythagoras, Western science has tended to view nature in mathematical terms. A century before Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton looked upon mathematics as the instrument by which man is called to understand the script God employed in creating the universe. Kepler shared this view when he wrote, "Just as the eye was made to see colors, the ear was made to hear sounds. The human mind was made to understand quantity." The natural sciences, it is a fact that in the natural sciences, much activity we associate with natural science is an attempt at description, framed mathematically, an attempt to grasp accurately the matter under consideration rather than explanation. And yet the mind is not satisfied. The mind is not content with mere description. It seeks to know the intrinsic nature of things. Why are they as they are and behave as they do? Much of that knowledge is attained by inference. The knowledge we have of the submicroscopic is all by inference. The mental mechanisms by which we hold that knowledge entails the creation of models, plausible mechanisms responsible for the phenomena observed. Those models may be either sententional, that is, equations, for example, we express them in sentences, or iconic, a mental picture or a diagram. You pick up any science book, it's going to be full of diagrams. Thus, in the history of theoretical physics, we find successively sophisticated schema depicting the atom as our knowledge increased. We are led to recognize that our knowledge of nature is open-ended, the focus of an intellectual quest never fully satisfied. A classic example illustrative of the nature of scientific method is found in Newton's Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, published in 1687. It's called one of the most important single works in the history of modern science. We speak of modern physics up to the coming of quantum mechanics as Newtonian physics. And with Newton, we're in the age of Galileo, Kepler, Boyle, Haley, Descartes, Gassendi, and Leibniz, intellectual giants all. Throughout the 17th century, physics had begun to replace qualitative analysis with quantitative precision. That presented a problem for Newton. Newton himself wrestled with the problem of how to relate the common new algebraic analyses of modern approaches with the venerated methods of the ancients. Newton considered himself to be an Aristotelian. For him, large questions loomed. When is a geometrical construct exact? What guarantees the applicability of geometry to mechanics? A clear account of Newton's method can be found in another book which I find myself recommending, and that's William Harper's Isaac Newton's Scientific Method, subtitled Turning Data into Evidence About Gravity and Cosmology. And Harper gives us a good overview, and I'm drawing on him now. Harper traces the steps by which Newton argued from the phenomena of orbital motion to the centripetal forces and then to universal gravity. Thus, this in turn enabled him to calculate the masses of the sun and the planets from the orbits about them, and further led to his decisive resolution of the problem of deciding between geocentric and heliocentric world systems. Newton concluded that neither is completely accurate because both the sun and the earth are moving relative to the center of the solar system. The sun, he finds, never recedes very far from the center of this mass, thus making it possible to achieve approximate calculations of the complex motion of the planets by successively more accurate models. As the familiar model of scientific investigation would have it, hypotheses are verified by conclusions to be drawn from them. Or put another way, empirical success is determined by and limited to accurate prediction. Newton begs to differ with what has become the positivist understanding, Humean understanding, Comte understanding of science. In addition to accurate prediction, thought Newton, a theory must be an attempt to explain. That's certainly Aristotle. A true explanation turns theoretical questions into ones which can be empirically answered by measurement of relevant phenomena. But more than that, theoretical propositions inferred from phenomena, when successful, Newton found may provisionally serve as a guide to further research. Newton's argument for universal gravity and its application to the solar system, Harper points out, bore fruit in Kepler's use of physical causes to overcome the empirical equivalence between heliocentric and geocentric world systems. Newton employed the notion of gravity as a physical cause to explain planetary motion, even though he was unable to find the initial cause of orbital motion itself. He further generalized his theory of gravitation to all planets. All celestial bodies are kept in their orbits by centripetal forces of gravity, and Newton was able to calculate those forces to be the inverse of the square of the distance from their centers. Now that again is Aristotelian. From an encounter with one, he was able to extrapolate to all. That's the process of abstraction. Causal mechanisms are often inferred, but are rarely encountered. But they are important non-observables postulated in physical theory that work to facilitate understanding. A good example of that, I think, is found in the work of Marie Curie and her husband. When Madame Curie first began her study of minerals, her attention was drawn to the mineral pitchblende, uranite. She reasoned that its emission of rays could only be explained by the presence in the ore of an unknown substance or substances. Joined by her husband Pierre, she undertook to resolve the question. Using sophisticated measuring techniques, by measuring the action of the rays given off on magnetic fields, the Curies proved the existence of varying amounts of three particles: electrical, positive, negative, and neutral. Sir Ernest Rutherford later called them alpha, beta, and gamma rays, and everybody's heard about them. The varying amounts of these particles, it was eventually determined, was caused by the radioactivity of radium and thorium. The term radioactivity was first introduced by Maria. She invented the term. The investigative techniques of the Curies in that same year led them to deduce the existence of two previously unknown elements, later called polonium. Marie was from Poland, and the name given to polonium was to honor her home country, and radium. Clearly, their discoveries were not the product of an observed sequence. Rather, we find in their work a reasoned explanation of something otherwise unintelligible. The explanatory principle involved in the Curie example is a principle of sufficient causality. Expressed in its simple form, the principle states, things are events which do not fully explain themselves with respect to their origin or properties must be explained in terms of something other than themselves. Mere experience of things joined in space and time is not enough to satisfy the inquiring mind. The question of why we experience things conjoined begs to be answered. The fact that two things are always conjoined sequentially or by proximity may be due to the fact that they are causally related, but then perhaps not. Only through a reasoning process does the intellect grasp the mechanism responsible for the causal bond, if such be the case. To call something the cause of the other is an attempt to explain the other. Now, in 1933, the state of particle physics was such that it seemed necessary to postulate the existence of a particle as yet undetected. The Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, assuming its existence, nobody had ever found it, built his theory of beta decay upon it and gave the undetected particle the name neutrino, Italian for little one. Even with the support of Niels Bohr, certainly one of the greatest, if not the greatest, physicists of the 20th century, he was subjected to negative remarks while people teased him about his poltergeist, since no one had empirically shown it to exist in spite of its theoretical necessity. It remained a theoretical entity until Clyde Cowan, with access to a particle accelerator at Hanford, Washington, performed an experiment that confirmed the neutrino's existence. And he duplicated that experiment in 1956 at the Savannah River Laboratory in Georgia. And as it said, the rest is history. I personally knew Clyde Cowan when I joined the faculty at Catholic University. He was a member of the physics department there, and I became acquainted with him. As a matter of fact, some of my best buddies were his students. This example, the example of finding the neutrino, illustrates, again, the principle of sufficient reason, sometimes called the principle of efficient causality, wherein an explanation is sought for something otherwise unintelligible. But I'm repeating myself on that. Now, historians of science remind us that there is no obvious point at which Newtonian physics replaced Aristotle's natural philosophy, or for that matter, when the old order of physics associated with Newton gave way to the new order of quantum physics. Sheila Jones, in a book that you will find highly interesting, a book called The Quantum 10. She has written a fascinating account of one of the most exciting periods in the history of physics. Max Planck is credited with introducing the word quanta into the lexicon of physics in 1900. And he was to play a significant role in what came to be known as the quantum revolution of the mid-1920s. In classical physics, it was assumed that energy flows in a continuum. But in quantum physics, energy is thought to come in chunks or quanta, which can only be described mathematically. For most physicists, it's not necessary to visualize the quantum world, so long as their calculations match their experimental results. It does not matter that the symbols in mathematics they use might or might not have any link to the physical world. Jones quotes Murray Gell-Mann as saying, "We all know how to use it and how to apply it to problems, and so we have learned to live with the fact that nobody can understand it." After more than 90 years, physicists are still having trouble reconciling classical and quantum worlds. A distinction has to be made, of course, between quantum theory and quantum mechanics. Although we speak of the package as quantum physics, the difference can be illustrated by the difference between the work of Max Planck and that of Arnold Sommerfeld, a difference that Seth Salmon calls the difference between physics of principles and physics of problems. Suman characterizes the work of Planck, as well as that of Einstein, as subsuming all physical phenomena under a few general axioms, principles transcending particular data. For Planck, the place of experiment within theoretical practice is limited to testing conclusions. Sommerfeld, on the other hand, starts with experimental data. He's interested in the real world of engineering problems. Theoretical physics, as practiced by Sommerfeld, is an interdisciplinary creation, drawing upon mathematics and technical mechanics as well as physics. His is a search for specific solutions to specific problems, a search for a mechanism or a process rather than for a general postulate or a theoretical explanation. Unlike Planck and Einstein, he did not want to get into abstract theory and waste time debating with philosophers. The two styles of pursuing physics proved to be mutually illuminating. Sommerfeld's investigation of atomic spectra led him to suggest that elliptical orbits replace circular orbits of the Bohr atom. From this idea, he postulated the azimuthal quantum number and later introduced the magnetic quantum number as well. Sommerfeld's interest in the real world engineering paid off in a remarkable way. Seth Solman tells us that in Munich, between 1908 and 1931, Sommerfeld directed 10 doctoral dissertations, supervised or co-sponsored others as well. 8 of these doctoral candidates in getting their PhDs discussed some aspect of electromagnetism. Sommerfeld students, because of their training in hydrodynamics, electromagnetism, and because of their work on gyroscopes, had military implications. So much so that during World War I, his PhD students became known as the Kaiser's physicists, given their contribution to the German war effort. It was the failure of Newtonian physics in the 19th century to construct a mechanical or atomic model of matter and ether, one that would explain thermal and magnetic properties, that led Ludwig Boltzmann, his dates 1844, 1906, to develop now something new, probabilistic physics. In a seminal article in 1887, a little more than a decade after Planck had introduced the notion of quantum, Boltzmann, in his statistical mechanics, not only assumed the existence of invisible molecules, but in his work relied on mathematical probabilities instead of experimental measurement. For that, he earned the scorn of Ernst Mach and other positivists of the Vienna Circle. Mach's positivism, following the lead of the French philosopher Auguste Comte, I didn't spend any time on him, but I could have, denied the power of the intellect to reason from the seen to the unseen, and led Mach to oppose the use of atoms and probabilities in scientific explanations. The only meaningful statements a scientist can make, Mach insisted, are about what can be measured, counted, tested, or which otherwise rests on the experience of the senses. Mach refused to accept the existence of atoms even when presented with experimental evidence, because atoms, you still deduce them. Sheila Jones, who tells us much about that period and for whom I rely on for a lot of information, was led to remark positivism, perhaps more accurately called negativism, had all but killed theoretical physics in France. The dramatic shift from Newtonian physics to the puzzling world of quantum gave rise to many a philosophical treatise. Aware of the philosophical landscape at the time, Jones couldn't resist a humorous passage, offered her assessment of the whole thing. Positivism has no God and no external world. Logical positivism has no God and no external world, but it does have mathematical logic. Kantianism has no external world, but it does have God. And then she proclaims realism, what I'm calling Aristotelianism, allows for both God and the external world. German mathematicians and physicists, while not philosophically illiterate, it may be said, did not demonstrate philosophical leanings, at least not on the job, and for the most part did not try to bring their scientific activity into logical connection with their philosophy. By 1930, most physicists simply abandoned the need for a theory of a philosophical theory, that is, of quantum physics. No matter how useful, this is me now, mathematical techniques may be in the study of nature, subject matter yet determines method. The way we ordinarily talk about mind and human nature, for example, does not fit well with our understanding of the world derived from theoretical or mathematical physics. The realm of reason, the realm of judgment, of belief, and of desire is independent of physical or biological facts about human agency. We may be every bit a part of nature, as are the elements that surround us, but there are important facts about what we do and what we think that have no counterparts when the subject is human nature. to explain human behavior in the language of physics or chemistry or by causal accounts that cast human beings as collection of physical particles is to miss that which is distinctive about human beings. Philosophers who grapple with the problem of universals and the abstract power of the human intellect and who work as strict empiricists or materialists often go to absurd lengths to avoid reference to the non-material character of human knowing. A frequent mistake in this area of research is to confuse mind with brain activity. To assume that the nervous system and the brain are the cause of what goes on in consciousness. From an Aristotelian point of view, mind is clearly bodily and cannot be discussed apart from brain activity. But discussions of human intellect are something else. While intellection cannot take place apart from sensation, the two are not the same. How one discusses the relationship is important. See, I'm getting ahead of something. How one discusses that relationship depends first on a clear distinction between sensation and intellection. Sense knowledge obviously provides the material for the intellectual formation of concepts, universals that transcend sensory experience. Recognition of the transcendent or non-material aspects of human knowing entails a modeling of human nature that finds its prototype in Aristotle's posterior analytics. Now, if you have a taste for the subject, and if I haven't given you enough books to read, you might wish to contrast Aristotle with Paul Churchland, prominent guy, University of California, Berkeley, who has produced a purely materialistic account of human knowing in a work entitled, believe it or not, Plato's Camera. Well, I'll leave you with that. I'm not recommending Churchland or his wife, who's also a philosopher. Well, if you don't like anything I've said, object. If you want to add to it, some of you may know a whole lot more than I do about some of the things I discussed. So we're open for, you don't have to ask a question. You can tell me what you know about what we've talked about. I'm not going to slap you down. I'm not grading you.
We had a discussion in one of the honor sections, and Matt, this is directed for you. Matt is going to be a physician, I think, right?
I hope to.
Right. And we were on the topic of whether anything else is happening in the mind other than brain activity. That is, so this is very appropriate. Can thinking be completely reduced to brain activity? Mm-hmm. And I think at the start of the period you were inclined to say yes. So maybe some question or conversation here would be.
Well, if your brain is doing all the work, why do you have to work so hard? Is it your eye that's seeing, or is it you that's seeing? I mean, Aristotle had no problem. The intellect needs a brain to function. Mm-hmm. And if the brain is malformed, some years back I had a stroke, which has left me somewhat handicapped. My brain was closed down for a period. Some may think it's still closed down, but so to remember something, it's harder with age. But even young people have a tough time remembering Do you remember the speed of light? Can you cite that right offhand?
3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second.
Now, was that your brain or was that you?
I think it was my brain. I mean, I feel like you can't make the distinction between you and your brain. I don't know. I feel like you are sort of a, projection of your brain, in a way, I guess you could say.
Or is it the other way around? Is it you that uses your native ability? Not all brains are created alike, that's for sure.
Right, I agree, yeah.
Some people are more intelligent than others. Some groups are more intelligent, so on. But, I mean, you can pursue that, but prove it. Can you prove it? Really? Not even a guy like Paul Churchill attempts to prove it.
Well, can't you say, like, if you affect someone's brain, like, who is the guy in psychology? It's a big thing in psychology. The guy who's working on the railroad tracks and the pin went through his brain and his entire personality changed.
Wait a minute, slow down. I didn't hear that. Say it again. Say it again.
Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage, yeah.
Okay.
So Phineas Gage
was
working on a railroad track, really old story, and an explosion happened, and one of the big nails to hold the railroad track down went through his head and went through a part of his brain that altered his personality completely. He was almost a completely different person after that.
Yeah, well, that's what a stroke does.
Sure, yeah. So I think that if you can physically affect the brain or manipulate it somehow, you can change the mind. So that leads me to believe that the mind is connected to the physicality of the brain.
Well, there's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
The word mind is bodily. It's not just intellect. Now, the term intellect is different than mind.
Yeah.
The term intellect refers to a non-material part of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
But that intellect doesn't work unless as the eye cannot see, unless the...
Right. So I just think that the intellect is sort of, preceded, I guess, by the physicality or the physical object. So I believe the metaphysical object is preceded by the physical object. So without the physical object, you can't have the intellectual object, and not the other way around, sort of. So in my mind, I connect everything metaphysical with something physical, because I don't think the metaphysical could exist without the physical. If we didn't have minds, we couldn't study philosophy or understand anything sort of conceptual about the universe. Just like an animal can't, you have to have the human and the human mind in order for those things sort of to exist, I guess.
Sure.
And by our discovery of them, I would say.
Yeah. But you also have something you didn't touch on, and that is the immaterial character of human knowing, the abstract. Yeah. Thought is abstract, universal. There's nothing concrete about it.
Yeah.
But where do you get your thoughts?
Right.
From experience.
Yeah, that is a deep...
But there is more in the sense report than the senses themselves are able to appreciate. We see a bird, and you know what a bird is. We can distinguish sensorily the blue jay from the purple martin. But we have a concept that applies to them and to sparrows and ducks and other things as well.
Mm-hmm. A prototype? What they say in psychology is prototype, I guess.
I'm not hearing you, and that's my fault.
He said prototype.
Is that what they call it in psychology, a prototype?
Well, you could if you're doing taxonomy. So the language varies, depends on the discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I think a question that we were onto is whether thinking is just a brain process, and I think that's the way you started out. Thinking is nothing but a brain process, And I thought maybe you moved to saying that the brain was necessary for thinking, but it wasn't identical with it.
Well, my day, teachers would say, use your brain. So, but it's you. And you're the same guy that caused trouble when you were 2 years old. And you may even have memories from, when you're 2 or 3. What is your all of us could answer that question. What is your earliest memory? Probably when you're 2 or 3, you can think back. You have a memory of what you were when you were 2 or 3. Where's that been all the time?
Yeah, so I guess what you're getting at sort of is we know that thought is because of neural connections in the brain and synapses, chemical messengers, but we don't know how that information is actually stored or retrieved. And that's something we still don't know. We can measure brain activity with like PET scans and stuff like that, but we can't say with certainty, here's this thought in someone's brain, here's where it is, we can see it right there.
No, you can't.
No.
That's
but we know how thought happens, and it's because of neural connections in the brain and synapses, but we can't say.
We know how thought happens because we think.
Wow.
And when we think, we're using our brain. When we see, we're using our eye. Close your eyes, you don't see.
Right, but without the brain, if we still had eyes, we
Well,
wouldn't
there's
see.
no doubt about that. That's not what is at issue. Nobody denies that. But what is denied by people who promise to explain everything in a purely materialistic fashion is intellect itself, the immaterial character of intellect. And if you want Aristotle's reasoning for that, look at his theory of abstraction. I didn't touch on that. I have a little book, The Nature of Scientific Explanation, which I do. And one of these books, which I'm recommending here today, though I haven't read it, just the topic, goes a long way into that.
So thank you for your talk, Professor Dougherty. Back here. I can stand up.
He does.
So I was unfortunately a little late to your paper, and you touched on many things after I came in, and I remember you mentioning the case of Marie Curie, and you mentioned quantum physics, and then you ended on philosophy of mind, so the debate between dualists positing a mind, an immaterial mind, and a physical body, and monists who would posit, well, there is only brain. And of course there's the other position, well, there is only mind, only immateriality is real. And I think an interesting line to tie this up, to link this up with what you said and what you two debated, is the question that you, or a contrast that you brought up when it comes to the goals of physical theories or scientific theories, namely that the goal is to give explanations of natural events, of natural things. So how is it that certain things are the case? And you made an interesting contrast between theoretical necessity. So for the sake of the theory, it is necessary to pose certain entities, certain concepts.
Well, no, the theory is the explanation.
Yes. So in order to explain, we need to make room for certain sort of X factors that are not empirically observable. And you mentioned the example of quantum mechanics. Okay, so my question here is specifically about the mind-body problem, namely, and this could strengthen either your point. What was your name?
Matt.
So this could strengthen either your point, Matt, or your point, Professor Dougherty, namely, in the debate between dualists and monists, what is of theoretical necessity to posit for either side in order to support their idea that there either is only brain or that there is mind? So the question is, and the debates I'm thinking about here was initiated by Thomas Nagel in the 1967. What is it like to be a bat? So the idea is that and this might be really interesting read for you. So the idea is that scientific knowledge is about what is sort of interpersonally observable, but it can't account for what is going on inside of me. So it can't make sense of me seeing a particular shade of blue, right? And this seems to me is what you are referring to when you mention when you mention Aristotle's chapter 19, posterior analytics, book 2, right? The activity of the nous. And I don't know if this is a real question. I guess if I would have to, if you pin me down and say, what is your question, Thea, I would probably ask, what is theoretically necessary to posit for a dualist theory of mind?
Well, I don't talk that way, but first of all, I don't accept a distinction between mind and body.
Okay.
Mind is bodily.
Okay.
What I think you're getting at is the Aristotelian distinction between form and matter. Every living thing is composed of two principles, material principle and the principle of form, which determines the nature of the matter. An example, the oak tree grew out of an acorn way back. You trim the tree. You trim oak trees, maybe you do. That doesn't modify the nature. The nature is intact. You cut the tree down, and what do you have? You have a collection of cellulose molecules
Firewood.
that hang together for a time. The form of the oak no longer exists. Animals form and matter. Man, form and matter. With Aristotle, you have a reasoning to an immaterial form. I mean, you get it first, I guess, in Plato. So you have an immaterial form. You get that as a result of examining the nature of knowledge, the abstract, immaterial character of knowledge. But neither form nor matter can exist independent of the other. So Aristotle's notion of science really begins with his natural philosophy, which I kind of assumed here, didn't go into. But you never end up with a mind-body problem. You end up with a soul. Forms of plants, animals, man are called souls. So you end up with a soul matter, but not soul body. The body is product of informed matter. That's how I would answer it from an Aristotelian perspective, but you would have to dig into the posterior analytics. You would have to dive into Aristotle's De Anima, and then perhaps read his Metaphysics. Now, Avicenna, a great Persian commentator on Aristotle, said he read the Metaphysics 40 times without understanding it. And only when he memorized the whole thing did he finally come to an understanding of Aristotle's metaphysics. So maybe the lesson there is don't try it on your own. Study with somebody who knows it.
Well, we know what he did to the intellect, right? I mean,
Yeah.
speaking about dualism and Aristotle.
Yeah.
I mean, he says he understands.
Well, dualism comes in with Descartes.
Sorry?
That's where you get the mind-body problem. So,
Thank you.
well,
More questions?
well, I hope I have introduced you to some good books that you may want to put in your library, assuming you're a serious student and can afford it. But I'm sure they're in your library or will be shortly.
And one question that was posed in philosophy class a couple lectures ago was, we read Adler, and he said that math doesn't claim to be knowledge of reality, and it's not really a scientific knowledge. What would you hold with respect to math? Like, is it knowledge of reality? Is it a scientific knowledge? Or is it simply just a descriptor of?
Or what is the word mathematics? Math?
Yes.
Well, we can't reason to a lot of things without mathematics.
Yes.
And we express a lot of our knowledge mathematically. Newton found that some of his mathematical descriptions, he had a hard time relating them to what he knew otherwise. He comes out of an Aristotelian background and then finds that the only way you can tackle certain problems is through mathematical measurement, which is expressed mathematically. But the expression, and this is Newton's problem, and it may be what you're getting at, how to relate this abstract mathematics to the real world. How, because your mathematics, your geometry, calculus leads a life of its own, so to speak. But you got there because you're trying to explain something. Now, how to relate it to what you're trying to explain?
Yeah, I think the point Adler was claiming that
You're talking about
mathematics.
Mortimer Adler.
Mortimer Adler.
Oh, yeah.
He was claiming, who you know well, he was claiming that mathematics does not tell you anything about nature. It might be used to express something about nature, but it's not an investigative science that will give you information about nature. Is that
Yes.
how we were understanding?
Well, that's pretty good. I wish I said that. Mortimer Adler, I knew him, of course, and he is responsible for the last edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He was in charge of that. And I had one of my former students do a review of the philosophy in the Britannica. He went through one draft, I was unhappy. Second draft, unhappy. Finally, he said, "This is it, Dougherty, take it or leave it." Well, I took it and sent a copy to Adler. He wrote back, "I've just made 35 copies."
Oh.
I published it in the Review of Metaphysics, and he sent it to all his editors, because even he didn't have the type of overview that Robert Wood, who was in my first class when I taught metaphysics at Marquette. He didn't buy into Aristotle. He went off studying Kant and Hegel and Heidegger and those people. So that tells you how effective I am as a teacher. But lately,
He has many disciples, as we were talking about this.
Well, this type of class, honors metaphysics. My first teaching experience. I hadn't taught anything. And I had the brightest and the best at Marquette at the time studying philosophy. And one guy, when I assigned a particular translation of the De Ente et Essentia, I assigned Father Armand Maur's translation of that important work. Can I use my mother's translation? My father, the dean of a graduate school, thinks it's pretty good. So from then on, I gave my students permission to use their. Well, the translator was Clara Riedel, who indeed was a Toronto scholar of some distinctions. But Bob Wood, in that class, is just publishing a book coming out, Catholic University of America Press. I reviewed it for the press, and only last week I was sent the blurb as a blurb for the dust jacket, what I said about Bob Wood. Though he left Aristotle behind, he nevertheless did a lot of good stuff on his own. Robert Wood taught at the University of Dallas most of his career. I once tried to hire him, but his wife didn't like Washington, D.C. She wouldn't cut.
Well, we have a luncheon appointment, so I thank you all for coming. Good questions and good interaction. Did you want to say something else?
No.
No? Okay. Do it. We could take 5 more minutes if you wanted to.
No, I am finished. I probably said more than I should.
No, thank you.
Yeah.